She was 19 and newly widowed, with a black mourning bonnet still stiff from the milliner's press, a ferryman's brass toll counter worn smooth at the thumb, and 4 pence knotted into the corner of a linen handkerchief. And with that, Eliza Vane became the reluctant owner of a sunken ferry dock at the bend of the river below Thorn's Reach, a crossing her husband's family had laughed at her for accepting. But what none of them knew, and what none of them had troubled to ask in the 11 years the dock had lain under water at every high tide, was that chained to the old footing beneath the third piling, there was something that would turn every one of their smirks to silence. Settle in with a cup of tea, and if you like quiet stories told slowly, subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Eliza Vane had been born Eliza Cobb in a narrow cottage above the lock-keeper's yard at Millbrook, the only living child of a bargeman named Josiah Cobb and his wife Ruth, who had buried 2 infants before Eliza and none after. Her father was a quiet man who read the river the way other men read scripture, who could tell by the color of the water at the mill race whether the level would rise in the night, and who kept his tally of cargo in a hand so careful that the wharfinger sometimes copied his figures rather than his own. Her mother took in washing for the better houses along the towpath, and had brought into the cottage the small disciplines of that trade: linen folded to the thread, starch mixed to the day's damp, a habit of humming to the copper while it boiled. It was her mother who taught Eliza her letters, out of a cracked hymnal that had come down from a grandmother none of them had known, and Eliza grew up believing that a life was a thing assembled the way a rope was laid, strand over strand, under steady tension, or it would not hold at all. Nothing in that house was given. It was built. She was 9 when her mother's chest went bad in a wet November and did not mend by spring. It was after the funeral that Eliza was sent, first for an afternoon and then for whole days, to old Nan Prout, who had kept the ferry crossing at Thorn's Reach for 30 years before her hands grew too stiff for the pole, and who had taken, for reasons the parish never quite settled among itself, a liking to the lock-keeper's gray-eyed girl. Nan Prout was 68 and had buried a husband and 2 sons to the river in 3 separate winters, and she taught Eliza what her own mother had not lived to finish teaching her: how to read a current from the set of the reeds, how to splice a parted rope so the join would not catch on a cleat, how to keep a toll book that would satisfy a magistrate, how to caulk a seam with oakum and pitch so it would hold through a flood season. She taught her, above all, how to look at a wrecked hull or a rotten piling and see what could be saved in it, and what could not, and never to spend a shilling finding out the difference the hard way twice. From Nan Prout, Eliza received 2 things she kept for the whole of her life. The first was practical: a small tin toll box with a brass counter set into its lid, the kind that clicked once for every soul carried across, worn from 30 years of thumbs, and inscribed on its base in a shaky scratch. For Eliza, who counts true. The second was smaller and dearer, a length of good tarred rope no longer than a hand, spliced into a perfect eye at one end, which Nan had made her practice on 100 times before pressing this one, the first one Eliza had ever gotten right, into her palm and saying only, "You'll tie truer knots than I did, and it won't cost you what it cost me." Eliza kept the little spliced rope on a string around her wrist from the day of Nan Prout's funeral, 2 winters later, and had not been parted from it since. She was 16 when she went to work properly, first mending nets for a fishmonger's wife in Millbrook, and then, at 18, as a laundress and mender in the household of a Mr. Eliza Vane, a boat builder of modest means and quiet habits, whose only son, Thomas, was 2 years older than Eliza and worked the yard alongside his father by day and mended his mother's account books by candlelight, and who fell, slowly and then all at once, for the girl who turned his cuffs and never once shorted the collar starch. Their courtship was brief, and, in the eyes of Thomas's Aunt Prudence and his elder sister Constance, deeply unwelcome. Eliza had no dowry, no family left to speak of, and no polish beyond what Nan Prout had drilled into her at a toll booth in the rain. And though Eliza Vane received her kindly enough for a tired old man glad to see his son settled, his sister Prudence, who kept house for him after his wife's death, and ruled the parlor as though it were still hers by right, never once called Eliza by her Christian name. They had 14 months together. Thomas caught a fever off the river in the autumn of Eliza's 19th year, the kind that swept the low wharves every few seasons and took the young and the old and left the middling alone, and he was 3 weeks dying of it, long enough to hold her hand through the worst nights, and long enough to say to his father, in a whisper the whole sick-room heard, that Eliza was not to be turned out. His father promised. His father followed him into the ground 11 weeks later, worn through with grief and a chest complaint of his own, and by then the promise belonged to a house full of people who had never wanted her in it. What Eliza carried out of that house when the time came was very little. Her second-best dress, a change of linen, the little tin toll box with its brass counter, the spliced rope on its string, a miniature of Thomas no bigger than a farthing in a cracked leather case, and the hard, quiet certainty that she had been loved, properly and without condition, by 3 people in her life, her mother, Nan Prout, and Thomas, and that all 3 of them were gone, and that whatever came next she would have to build with her own 2 hands, using the tools they had left her. And trusting the steadiness they had all 3 sworn was in her. The manner of her going was settled, as such things always were in that house, by other people, at a table she was never asked to sit at. 9 days after old Eliza Vane was buried, a solicitor's clerk came down from the county town, a Mr. Fenimore, narrow as a lath and dressed in dusty black, and read the will aloud in the front parlor with the blinds half drawn against the afternoon. Aunt Prudence sat bolt upright in Eliza's own chair. Constance sat beside her, hands folded, with the particular stillness of a woman waiting to be pleased. Eliza was given a hard chair near the door, as though she were a witness and not a widow, and she folded her hands in her lap and listened. Yard, timber stock, boatshed, and house, everything under that roof passed to Constance and her husband outright. There was a page of small bequests to the yard's 2 journeymen. There was a modest sum set aside for the church poor box. And then, near the foot of the page, in a paragraph Mr. Fenimore read with careful blankness, there was the matter of a leasehold on a stretch of river frontage at Thorn's Reach, comprising a ferry crossing, a dock, and the toll rights attached to it, which the late Mr. Vane had acquired years before in settlement of a bad debt, and had never troubled himself to visit, being, by every account that reached the yard, sunk at every high tide and worth nothing to a builder of boats. This, the will directed, was to pass to his son's widow, Eliza Vane, née Cobb, absolutely and without encumbrance. There was a short silence. Then Constance laughed, a small dry sound, the kind used to shut a door rather than open one, and her husband cleared his throat and studied the ceiling. And Aunt Prudence said, without looking at Eliza at all, that it was very like Eliza's to keep his son's dying promise with the one thing in his possession that would drown a woman rather than shelter her. Mr. Fenimore coughed and passed Eliza a small oilcloth packet holding a heavy iron dock key and a single page of directions in a clerk's cramped hand. He said the crossing had been out of use for the better part of 11 years, and that she should not expect to find the dock in any state to be worked. Constance said, rather more clearly this time, that Eliza was welcome to the mud if she thought she could stand in it. Aunt Prudence rose and said, in a voice as flat as a plank, that the carrier's cart would call for Eliza's box on Thursday, and that it would be waiting packed in the hall. That was all. No one raised a hand, and no one raised her voice above what was needed. By nightfall, Eliza's small trunk stood corded by the front door with a label tied to its handle in Constance's neat script, and Eliza sat on the edge of her narrow bed and untied the corner of her handkerchief and counted her money. 4 pence. She knotted it back and laid out on the coverlet, the way Nan Prout had taught her to do before any journey, the things she meant to carry. Her second-best dress and the one she stood up in. A change of linen. The tin toll box. The spliced rope on its string which she never took off. The miniature of Thomas in its cracked case. And the oilcloth packet with the iron key inside. She did not weep, and she did not go down to make her farewells. On Thursday morning, before the house was properly stirring, she walked out with her trunk lifted onto the carrier's cart by the yard boy, and no one came down to see her off. The carrier took her as far as the crossroads at Sedge Fen, and from there she walked, a mile and then 2, with her trunk left to follow by a second cart, along a river road she did not know, between banks grown wild with willow and loosestrife, until she came to a bend where the water widened and slowed, and a track ran down through a stand of alders toward the crossing. There was a boy of perhaps 11 mending an eel trap on the bank, and he looked at her, and at the direction slip in her hand, and said, without much interest, that the ferry dock was round the next bend, and had been under water as long as he'd been alive, worth remembering. He walked with her the last stretch out of simple curiosity, and as they came round the bend she saw it for the first time. 3 rotted pilings leaning at angles out of the current, a walkway of gray, split boards half submerged even at this low hour, and beyond it on the bank, a boatman's hut with its door hanging by one hinge. She stood a long moment and said nothing at all, and the eel-trap boy waited without impatience, the way boys who grow up beside a river learn to wait, and then he wished her good day and went back to his trap. In her palm, the iron key had gone cold, and she looked at the wreck of a crossing that was now entirely hers. 9 oak pilings had once carried the dock some 40 feet out from the bank, decked with heavy planking and fitted with a windlass for the chain ferry itself, which she found still swinging loose from its mooring ring, half sunk, green with weed. 6 of the 9 pilings stood sound enough, driven deep into gravel that had not shifted in a generation. 3 had rotted at the waterline and canted outward, and it was these that had dragged the deck down at every tide until the whole structure sat awash at high water and only half usable at low. The hut on the bank had a good slate roof gone mossy but not broken, a stone hearth, a plank counter for the toll-taking, and nailed above the counter a faded card of the old fares, still legible. 1 penny the foot passenger, 2pence the beast, 4pence the loaded cart. She slept that first night in the hut, wrapped in her cloak on the plank counter, with the door propped shut by an oar she found leaning in the corner, and the spliced rope pressed against her wrist. In the morning she began. For the first 3 days she did nothing but wade and look. She walked the shallows at low water in her oldest boots, feeling with a boat hook along the line of the pilings, the way Nan Prout had once shown her to feel for soundness in a hull, tapping, listening for the dead thud that meant rot, and the live ring that meant good wood still holding. She counted the way Nan had taught her, 6 sound pilings, 3 gone, a deck of perhaps 60 planks of which she judged 20 fit to reuse, the rest fit only for kindling. A chain, badly rusted but unbroken, still shackled to its windlass. A windlass itself, seized with rust but not cracked at the frame. She wrote it all down in pencil on the back of the fare card, the way a woman meaning to keep accounts needs first a place to keep them. 4 mornings in, she walked down into Thorn's Reach village and found the smith, a broad, quiet man named Hollies, and engaged him to forge 3 new iron collars to sleeve the sound end of new oak piles, and to look over the old chain link by link for weak metal. She found the timber yard and bargained hard in the flat, unhurried way Nan Prout had taught her to bargain, for green oak that would need seasoning and old ship's timber, already hard, that would not. She found Widow Tull, who kept the crossing-side cottage nearest the hut and had once, years before the dock went under, sold pasties to the ferry trade, and Widow Tull, seeing the black bonnet and the pale, steady face beneath it, said she had a spare bed and would take 4 pence the week and no more, and would throw in a hot supper besides, because a woman rebuilding a dock alone needed her strength kept up more than her purse kept full. Pilings first, then decking, then windlass, then chain, then the hut, then the fares. The work went in the order Nan Prout would have set it. Holly's brought a nephew, a lanky boy called Sam, to help drive the new piles with a handram, working at low water in a stretch of days when the tides ran favorable, and Sam whistled through his teeth the whole while and drank his tea with 3 sugars when Eliza gave it to him. A wheelwright turned cooper's man from the next parish, a Mr. Bray, planed and fitted new decking to match the old, working 2 weeks for his board and a fair day's coin, and swore the new boards would outlast the old by 20 years for being properly seasoned first. Widow Tull's grandson, a solemn boy of 10 named Peter, carried nails and held lanterns and was paid in gingerbread and pennies both. 6 weeks in, the 3 rotten pilings were drawn and burned, and 3 new ones stood sleeved in Holly's iron collars, driven true and deep. The old chain, cleaned link by link in a bath of vinegar and sand, ran sound through the windlass, which Holly's had freed of its rust and packed fresh with tallow. 20 of the old planks, scrubbed and relaid, sat flush beside 40 new ones, and the whole deck stood clear of the water even at the top of the tide for the first time in 11 years. It was on a still afternoon in the 7th week, while Eliza was working along the underside of the new decking near the 3rd piling, checking the fit of the joists with her hand the way Nan had taught her to check what the eye alone could not, that her fingers found a length of chain, quite separate from the ferry's own working chain, shackled fast around the base of that piling, below the old water line, and running down and away into the gravel of the riverbed itself. It was old iron, thick as her thumb, gone deep orange with rust but whole, and it had clearly been placed there with purpose, for it was fixed with a proper forged shackle and not merely looped and left. She followed it with her hands as far as she could without going under, and felt it run taut downward, toward something that did not move. She sent Peter for Sam and for Holly's longest coil of rope, and at the next low water, with Sam holding a lantern from the bank and Holly's himself come to lend his strength, she waded out to her waist, roped herself to the sound piling beside it after the fashion Nan Prout had once drilled into her for working near deep water, and worked her way down along the chain with her bare hands until she found, wedged into a hollow scoured beneath the old piling's footing, a small iron-bound chest, no larger than a lap desk, shackled fast to the chain in half, buried in gravel and river silt. It took the better part of an hour, and Holly's crowbar, and all 3 of them working the chain hand over hand from the bank, to work the chest free of the silt without tearing the shackle loose, and longer still to haul it, streaming and black with river mud, up onto the new decking. Eliza would not let it be forced open there in the open air with half the village beginning to gather at the sound of the windlass creaking. She had it carried, wrapped in sacking, up to the hut, and she bolted the door, and she sat with it alone by lamplight while Widow Tull kept her supper warm 2 doors down and did not ask why the light burned so late. The lock was rusted through and gave to a chisel with no more resistance than a biscuit. Inside, wrapped first in oiled canvas and then in a layer of tarred sailcloth that had kept the river almost entirely out, she found 3 things: a stout canvas purse, heavy with coin, a smaller box within the box of dark wood with a brass hasp, holding a set of silver spoons, a woman's gold locket, and a man's signet ring worn thin at the band. And laid flat across the top of all of it, wrapped separately in its own oilskin and tied with waxed cord, a single folded letter. She sat on the floor of the hut with the lamp beside her, and she opened the letter first. The wax cord had kept the damp almost entirely out, and the hand inside was old-fashioned, careful, a little cramped with age. She read it once through in silence, and then, because Nan Prout had always said that a thing read aloud is a thing properly understood, she read it again, aloud in the empty hut, her voice steady over the sound of the river outside. To whoever finds this and has troubled to look, it began, "My name is Jonas Pardoux, and I kept this crossing 41 years, from the age of 20 until my legs would no longer stand the pole. And my son Abel kept it 11 years after me, until the fever took him with no wife and no child to follow. I had no family living by the end. What I have set down here is what I saved across a working life on a poor man's toll, together with what little my late wife left me of her mother's silver, and I have chained it beneath the third piling, which I drove and sleeved myself and knew would outlast every other timber on this dock, because I would rather it went to whoever proved patient and careful enough to find it than to the county, who never once sent a man to mend so much as a plank in all the years they claimed the leasehold rents off me. Whoever you are, I hope you keep the crossing honest and the tolls fair, and I hope you do not let the river have the last word." It was signed in full and dated some 34 years back. Eliza counted the coin twice on the hut floor by lamplight. There were 86 guineas in cloth rolls, and a further sum in silver crowns and shillings that came, by her second exact count, to just short of £40 more. She wrote the sum in pencil inside the cover of her toll box, beside the tally Nan Prout's own hand had once scratched there, and she did not open the small wooden box with the spoons and the locket and the ring that night. She banked the fire, bolted the door, and slept with the spliced rope pressed to her wrist and the chest at her feet. In the morning she walked into the county town with 3 guineas in her pocket and a list in her head. She paid the smith in full, and engaged him besides to forge a proper new mooring ring and a set of iron fair posts. She opened an account at the county bank on the strength of Jonas Pardoux's coin, and the clerk who counted it looked at her twice, and treated her from that day as a woman with business to conduct rather than a girl to be humored. She had Widow Tull's grandson Peter fetch fresh whitewash for the hut, and she had the old fare card copied out fresh and fixed above the counter, the figures unchanged, because Jonas Pardoux's fares had been fair fares, and she saw no reason to better a dead man's honesty. By midsummer the crossing had ceased to be a ruin and had begun to be a working ferry again. Eliza took the chain herself most days, hauling the flat-bottomed punt hand over hand across the slow water, a penny the foot passenger, tuppence the beast, fourpence the loaded cart, and she kept her tally in Nan Prout's old toll box, the brass counter clicking true under her thumb the way it had once clicked the same under Nan's, 30 years before. Word went about the district that the Thorns Reach crossing ran again, and dry, and honest, and farmers who had been driving their carts 3 miles round by the county bridge began instead to come down to the river and pay their fourpence and save themselves the better part of a morning. Sam came most days now for a wage instead of a boy's pennies, working the far bank while Eliza kept the near one, and Holly sent his nephew's cousin, a girl called Martha Reed, to learn the toll keeping on the days Eliza wanted to walk into the village for her marketing. The vicar, a Mr. Aldous, thin and mild and 60 if he was a day, called at the hut one September evening and drank tea from a chipped cup among the drying nets, and said the parish had been the poorer for the crossing's silence, and was very much the better for its noise again. He asked whether Eliza might let the ferry carry the poor of the parish free on Sunday mornings, so that the far-bank cottages might reach the church without the long walk round, and Eliza said she would, and did, from that Sunday forward, and the brass counter clicked for them the same as for anyone who paid, because Nan Prout had taught her that an honest count stayed honest regardless of the coin behind it. In Thorn's Reach, she was known by her own name before the leaves turned. The carters who paid their fourpence at the post called her Mrs. Vane, and the women who bought her mother's old receipts for nettle cordage at the market called her Eliza, and both were said with the same plain respect. On winter evenings, with the crossing shut for the dark and the fire built up in the hut, she sat at the plank counter with her ledger, and the small wooden box with the spoons and the locket and the signet ring stood, still unopened past that first look, on the shelf where the old fare card had once hung alone. On a still afternoon in late November, when the last leaves had come down off the alders, and the sky over the river had settled into that low gray that meant frost within the week, Eliza sat alone in the hut at the counter she had scrubbed and oiled 6 months before. The fire drew clean through a chimney Hollies had repointed in October. The new windlass turned without a creak. The chain lay coiled, sound and greased, beside the punt moored steady at a dock that no longer sank at any tide the river cared to send it. She had before her, laid out on a square of clean sailcloth, 4 things, nothing more and nothing less. There was the tin toll box, its brass counter worn smoother now by her own thumb than it had ever been by Nan Prout's, open to the pencil tally of 86 guineas and 40 pounds, and beneath it now in ink, a running column of what had been spent and what remained. Beside it lay the spliced length of rope, untied for once from her wrist, because the hut was warm enough that she felt no need of it against her skin that evening. The cracked leather case held Thomas's miniature, his face no bigger than a farthing, turned a little to one side toward something she could not see. And she had Jonah's Pardew's letter, unfolded flat and weighted at its corners with 4 smooth river stones Peter had brought her for the purpose. 41 years of a stranger's patient thrift laid bare in a patient, old-fashioned hand. For a long while she sat with these 4 things before her. The rope had come from a woman who had watched her tie 100 bad knots without once losing patience, and had known, before Eliza's own mother had known it, that the girl had steady hands. The letter had come from a man 34 years dead who had never met her, and who had chosen a stranger's patience over the county's neglect. The miniature had come from a boy who had asked, with his last clear breath, that she not be turned out. 3 strangers, 1 debt of kindness paid 3 separate ways. The toll box carried, in its worn brass and its 2 hands of pencil and ink, the whole of what those 3 had left her to build with, and Eliza thought that the 3 of them, had they ever been introduced, would have understood one another without needing to be told. She thought of the parlor with the blinds half drawn, and of Constance's short, dry laugh, and of Aunt Prudence saying it was very like Selah's to keep a promise with the one gift that would drown a woman rather than shelter her. She did not think of them with any heat. She thought of them the way one thinks of a hard winter that has already passed over a house whose roof has since been mended. They had let her go for the price of a carrier's cart, and had not once written since to ask what had become of her. They would not write now. She understood, sitting there with the firelight on the brass counter, that they had never truly looked at that leasehold either, or at Jonah's Pardew's 41 years on the water, because to look would have meant to wonder, and to wonder would have cost them the certainty that let them laugh so easily, which was the only inheritance they had ever meant to keep for themselves. With the letter folded back into the cover of the toll box, and the leather case shut once more, she set the 4 things together in the shallow drawer beneath the counter. She did not rush. Then she banked the fire, pulled her cloak about her, and walked down to check the mooring one last time before dark, and stood a moment on the new decking, listening to the ordinary miracle of a chain running quiet through a windlass on a crossing that had been drowned for 11 years. Eliza Vane was 19 and newly widowed. She had 4 pence tied into a handkerchief and a solicitor's iron key wrapped in oilcloth, and she paid nothing to acquire the Sunken Ferry dock at Thorn's Reach that her husband's family had laughed at her for taking. It was the best inheritance she ever accepted. If you have stayed with Eliza this far, down the alder track and out onto a rotted deck, and under the third piling with a coil of rope and a borrowed lantern, take a moment now before you go to tap the small heart beneath this story so the channel knows you were here. And if it moved you at all, share it with someone who has been told, quietly or loudly, that what they were given was not worth the keeping. Subscribe if you have not yet, so the next tale of a drowned crossing and a patient woman finds its way to you when the evenings draw in. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight and whether your own river is running high or low. And before you go on with your evening, sit with this a moment. Almost every one of us has been handed, at some point, a thing other people were quick to call worthless. A crossing nobody thought worth mending. A trade nobody believed would feed us. A grief we were told to put down and get on with. A quiet skill learned at the elbow of someone older, who did not live to see us put it to use. The people who laugh at such inheritances almost always laugh because they have never troubled to wade out at low water and look closely, and looking closely would ask something of them they were never willing to give. Eliza's story is not, in the end, about a chest of coin chained beneath a piling. It is about the habit of looking patiently, and without shame, at what has been left in your 2 hands, and trusting that the woman who taught you to splice a rope true, and the boy who asked with his last breath that you not be turned out, and the stranger who chained a box to a footing 34 years before you were born, are all 3 of them together, on your side of the ledger. So the question we leave you with tonight is this: what has been handed to you that others were too quick to call worthless? And what might you find if you waded out at low water with a lantern and a little patience, and felt along the footing of your own plainest, most overlooked piling? Tell us in the comments. We read them in the evenings by our own fires. Keep your ropes coiled, keep your ledgers honest, and we will meet you again at the next bend in the river.